If you're a general fan of Thomas and Friends, or maybe you're just a parent who's had to watch a few too many episodes, we can all agree that the cast in this world is quite expansive. And with a world as developed as this one, there are bound to be some faces even casual fans won't know off the cuff. One such character goes by the name of Neil, who on first glance definitely stands out in terms of aesthetics, but is undoubtedly very obscure in the grand scheme of things. Some of you might refer to him as a glup shido, a term Star Wars fans have coined for all those background characters that have maybe a few seconds of screen time and possibly a line or two, who, for some reason, have names and maybe even some backstory. Thomas and Friends has more than its fair share of glup shidos. Many of those were born just for the sake of merchandise. Naturally, these characters didn't have to have any meaning or add anything new to the show, they just had to show up, say hi, and leave. Very shallow, very dull, very lackluster. On the other hand, you have many characters added to the show that have become iconic fan favorites like Paxton or Marion, who had a great impact. So why are we talking about Neil? He didn't even make it into the show. He solely appears in the books. And by books, I mean book. His only appearance is in the 20th book of the series, Very Old Engines. Though it's a pretty unique book for its premise, mind you. It takes us back to a time way before Thomas and the main cast we know even got to the island, on a railway that was once known as the Sodor and Mainland Railway. The story is set when Skarloey, one of the oldest engines on Sodor, first arrives on the island all the way back in 1865. So just in case you weren't sure, yeah, we're getting pretty obscure here for this one. Well, all this to say that this history that contextualizes Neil's first, and only, appearance is really what makes this character so worth talking about. Of course, it's very easy to say that the history is more important than the character, and please believe me when I say that this is not just a cop-out video where I just talk about some railway history and then say this was somehow about Neil the whole time. But the history provided by the Railway series book, as well as the real-life history, makes for an interesting discussion. So let's get into it with Neil's real-life history. All the information I could find on this guy came from the West Somerset Mineral Railway website, probably because their railway is the only one with any information on this engine. And while there is an extensive well of info on the railway itself and its story, there's not much to say about Neil, aside from the description under the only photo of him. Okay, but don't be disheartened. There's still more history here. A neat little thing about this engine is that the name of this locomotive is actually called a Nielsen, built in 1856 in Glasgow. Now, very serious question. If this engine is called Nielsen, then would that make our Neil, Neil's son? Boggles the mind, I know. Please, discuss below. Alright, to tell you the truth, that's about it for the history of this engine, really. But hey, don't cry, come on, it's okay. How about this? I could tell you about some of the history of Nielsen's railway until we get to the analysis. Alright, let me take you back about 3 years before our dear friend was built. Back to the year 1853, where a pair of men, Thomas Brown and Joseph Robinson, founded the Brendan Hills Iron Ore Company. The only problem was transporting all that ore 13 miles down to Watchet for export. As if that wasn't bad enough, they now had to find someone to actually design and spearhead the construction of this line, which was trickier than expected, and ended up delaying them until 1856. It was a grueling task, but 5 years later in 1861, the line was completed, costing about £82,000, which is about 1.5 million today. The line would continue developing, gaining an incline and introducing passenger traffic in 1865, which for us Thomas heads would be around the same time Skarloey and Rheneas came to Sodor. See, it's all connecting here. Sadly, when the year 1898 came along, the line was closed, but the rails and buildings were left intact. The line would receive sparse use for ore conveyance and some rail system experiments, but in 1916, the Ministry of Munitions would use metal and rails from the railway for the war effort, and anything that remained was sold off in auction years later. So our pal Nielsen likely went with it. Okay, most of you are probably thinking that what happened to our boy Nielsen likely happened to Neil No Son in the Railway series. And considering he only appears once in an extended flashback, who could blame you? However, this is where I can finally give you guys some good news. Something to latch onto. Neil is alive. Recently, it was revealed in the 1976 lecture, Railways of Sodor by Reverend Audrey himself, that Neil was sold to the Crovan's Gate Mining Company and still works there to this day. Unfortunately, we don't really know what happened to the other engines on the S&M railway, so if you weren't convinced there wasn't something to Neil's significance, well, strap in. If we're to talk about any meaning Neil might have for this universe, naturally we must look at his one and only scene. Now, Neil doesn't really offer us much in terms of character, or dialogue for that matter, because all he says really boils down to him telling Skarloey to watch out for the trucks, something that really can't be said enough on this island. From this, we can assume that Neil would fit nicely into the role of a helpful or guiding figure like Edward or Toby, who have, on many occasions, offered advice on dealing with trucks. But more importantly, we must give attention to Skarloey's short but sweet description of Neil. Ugly, but kind. This is in no doubt reference to his unconventional boxy shape, which, despite his many years of wisdom and experience, Skarloey still feels the need to comment on. I think this one statement has a lot for us to unpack about the world of Sodor and the value of its history. And yeah, we're gonna unpack it right now. Excessively. So let's start with the ugly that Neil is supposed to represent. It is through Skarloey's perspective we are supposed to understand that this visage is not an attractive one. But why? Because he's a box? Well, surely Toby and his brothers aren't unpleasant to look at, and that's to say nothing of the diesels that would later populate the island like Rusty, one of Skarloey's good friends. So why the disparagement? One can really only guess that this is because of Skarloey's impudence at the time, the central focus of these stories. It is to show how much Skarloey has grown since his younger days. A more arrogant Skarloey would naturally find reason to judge an engine that looks different from him. But what's so weird is that Skarloey decided to call him ugly all these years later anyway. I mean, he could have easily said, "At the time I found him ugly," or anything to amend those past feelings, but I would like to put forth the reason for this being that Skarloey associates Neil with a different time. A time where Sodor was incomplete and just about coming into being. Skarloey was notably upset he had to pull trucks instead of coaches, because the line was still under development, and so ugly. But let's get to my point here. I think Neil's ugliness makes him less important to the general viewer because he is not conventional, and so does not receive the same appreciation that other engines are given. And while I know that those of us here, for the most part, do appreciate Neil's inclusion in the series and love making headcanons and theories, it is clear to me that this is not so in-universe, since let's not forget this is his only appearance ever. While Skarloey does appreciate the kindness Neil shows, and acknowledges the good nature and hard work he does, it is still a rather small gesture that is still tied to a judgmental comment. So why does Neil have any sort of meaning to us as fans of the series? What value could we possibly derive from a minor character so minor I've had to spend more time talking about his real life history than his actual appearance? Well, I think it comes back to the second and more important part of this summary, his kindness. We talked about Edward and Toby before because they represent the moral epitome Audrey has in his work, and seeing that Neil shares these values and traits, it seems to me that the intention here is to highlight how the overlooked figures in history are some of the kindest. I would like to think that Neil's status in the lore is due to Audrey's fondness for railway history. I mean, the guy was named Neil after the Nielsen class of engine. So in this way, he is the representation of that part of history in the series. Audrey gives him an underlying underdog characterization in that way, so as to differentiate him from other obscure characters like Smudger or Stanley. No, not that one. Who are punished for their bad behavior. Neil, however, is rewarded for his good nature by being preserved. I believe it is through this intention that Audrey tries to tell his viewers that all history is important and the hidden figures of history are worth noting. I propose Neil being preserved offers us perspective on how we should view many of our hidden figures of history. People like Marsha P. Johnson, an iconic figure of gay rights, women's rights, and trans rights movements. I think Johnson, like Neil, might be lesser known in the grand scheme of history or the public sphere, but for those who remember them, they are nevertheless meaningful not just because of their kind disposition, but the foundations they built for those after them. With this I would also like to take a moment here to recognize the people of the Congo, whose society goes unmentioned in many global dialogues happening right now, despite the suffering endured by its people and resources. If you can take the time to appreciate the lesser-known figures of the fantastic world of Thomas and Friends, I should hope you can find it in your heart to bring attention to a matter of this magnitude. We must recognize the world around us is built on a lot of ugliness, and even if it's not as widely known, it still matters. But what matters today is how we accept that knowledge and use it towards acting on our futures, acting with kindness. So while Neil may be considered to be ugly, as well as many parts of history, his importance towards building the railway still matters and deserves to be remembered, like those figures of Marsha P. Johnson in the 60s and with the people of the Congo today. So let me end by saying this: Free Congo. And thank you for watching.